Minneapolis at that memorial. Thank you very much, Natasha. Well, now we can speak to Dr. Frank Leon Roberts. He's in New York City. He is also the nation's first professor to teach a Black Lives Matter seminar at New York University. He's also the founder of blacklivesmattersyllabus.com. Dr. Roberts, I'm going to start by asking you the question I've been asking a number of people today, because this really feels like somewhat a seminal moment for America. We've seen Black Lives Matter protests before, so how is this different this time around, and is it?
Sure. Well, in some ways, only time will tell in terms of long-term repercussions. But I will say this. What makes this moment feel different is that we are witnessing a kind of unprecedented convergence of three epidemics essentially happening at the same time. A public health epidemic that has claimed the lives of 100,000 Americans, disproportionately Black and brown folk. An economic epidemic where you have over 50 million Americans newly out of work, disproportionately Black and brown, and then a police epidemic emblematized and symbolized in the public lynching of George Floyd. So the convergence of all three of these epidemics, if you will, happening at the same time is part of why we see a kind of heightened atmosphere of civil and social unrest.
Well, we're also now hearing these promises of police reform and legislation being proposed, not only in Congress, as we've been hearing, but also by state and city legislators across the country. But that doesn't necessarily address the systemic racism that the Black Lives Matter movement wants addressed. So where does the movement itself go from here?
Well, in many ways, the question is not so much for me where the movement goes for here, but whether or not the public is willing to listen to what the movement has been saying for quite some time, right? The calls for a systemic, transformational redoing or reawakening of America are not new. They are not new from the movement for Black lives, and they're not new for Black people in general. So it's really about how do we finally listen to the voices of grassroots activists on the ground who have been telling us that we need a new society and we need policies to help us get there, but we also need a transformation in the way that we treat each other, the way we think about each other, and so forth.
You're talking about this need for a new society. It does seem that these calls for police reform are going beyond chokeholds and specific accountability mechanisms, but really calling for almost a reimagining of the entire role of the state and its security apparatus. What do you think that should look like?
Absolutely. So when you talk about calls, for instance, for dismantling the institution of the police or abolishing the police or defunding the police, the language is often shifting. But really what it generally refers to are three things: divestment, diversion, and decriminalization. So number one, divestment, which simply means a divestment from budgetary resources that are disproportionately allocated toward law enforcement at the expense of communities of color on the ground, right? So we're retracting from that model. Number two, diversion, meaning diverting away resources that traditionally might be going toward law enforcement salaries or hiring 1,000 new police officers, instead diverting those resources into the community, right? So instead of hiring 1,000 more police officers, what would it look like to hire 1,000 more social workers, right? That's what diversion looks like in practice. And then finally, decriminalization, which is an instrument for making police officers' job actually easier because they have fewer things to police, as well as making the public more safe. So for instance, when you hear people calling for the decriminalization of marijuana, that is in and of itself a tool towards dismantling some of the functions of the police, because in many urban centers, a disproportionate time is spent on behalf of police officers policing some of these criminal offenses, which actually need to be rethought and decriminalized. So again, divestment, diversion, and decriminalization are the way that we get to a defunding or a restructuring of how police show up in society.
In order to get there, in terms of progressing this movement, I want to ask a question about how to protest, because there's been so much discussion of non-violent protest over these last 2 weeks, and many have reprised the words, for instance, of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And it does seem, though, that needing to be willing to die without fighting back in order to progress a movement, that's incredibly brave, but also a huge ask of any individual in modern-day America and the America that you live in. Is there another way? What is it?
Well, the reality is we have to remember that protest is a form of public mourning. Justice is what love looks like in public. So when you see people taking to the streets in whatever form that looks like, that is an act of love. And it is also an act of public mourning. So the reality is there is a long history in the United States of essentially, to be quite candid, white Americans disapproving of any form that black protest takes. So if black protest takes the form of kneeling, as in the case of Colin Kaepernick, the public disapproves. If black protest takes the form of legislative change, the public disapproves. If protesting takes the form of looting and rioting, the public disapproves. So the reality is there has been, in the history of the United States, there has really been no form of black protest that has been deemed appropriate by the masses. And so for that very reason, we need to stop acting as though this is a genuine conversation, right? People are always going to be upset at black people doing what they've always done, which is keep their eyes stayed on freedom. And so my advice would be that activists on the ground, regardless of race or color, need to keep their eyes stayed on freedom and doing what they have to do to mourn in public.
Dr. Frank Leon Roberts there, the first professor to teach a Black Lives Matter seminar at New York University. Great to get your insights on Al Jazeera. Thanks for being with us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much.